Good evening, everyone. I'm Birgit Martin. I'm the past president of the Ontario Forage Council, and I'm going to be chairing this evening's Forage Focus. Welcome to the first webinar of the Forage Focus 2025 series. Our conference sponsors for Forage Focus this year is Porteous Russell Real Estate and Range Ward, and our speaker sponsor for this evening is Trillium Mutual Insurance. Our presentation tonight is about Triticale, the comeback kid. It is presented by Joanna Follings. Joanna is the cereal specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Agribusiness, and she is passionate about supporting growers with their cereal crop production challenges and opportunities. She's part of the Great Lakes Yield and Enhancement Network, YEN, team in Ontario, which is one of the global series of YENs that help local farmers better understand their winter wheat yield potential and what is contributing to that yield. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Joanna to talk about Triticale.
All right. Thank you so much, Bridget, and good evening, everyone. I'm excited to be here. A little bit nervous. One, I didn't realize this was the first session of the Forage Focus. And two, I'm a little bit nervous with the amount of people here. That's pretty exciting to see that so many people have this interest in Triticale. And I titled it The Comeback Kid because it has been around previously in Ontario, but it went away for a while and has recently made a resurgence, which is pretty exciting to see. And so tonight I just wanted to kind of go through how we can optimize our triticale production on farm, particularly as it relates to our livestock operations. So not just triticale, but winter cereals in general. I'm a huge fan because they provide a lot of versatility in your system and provide growers with a lot of options depending on what they're trying to achieve. So if they're seeded in the early summer or late summer, early fall rather, they can provide grazing options, or you can cut them in the spring for forage. You can also seed them in the spring. They won't head out like spring cereals will. But then they can provide you with some grazing options throughout the entire growing season. And then, of course, if winter cereals are taken to maturity, you can take both the grain and then you also have some bedding for livestock. So, we think of forages, we often think of things like alfalfa or corn silage. But for myself, anyways, I often go to winter cereals and think that they provide a lot of versatility on farm. And so today we're going to focus on triticale, just for time's sake. I was hoping to do a bit more comparisons with other cereals, but there's so much to talk about with triticale. We're going to primarily focus on that. So triticale is a cross of wheat and rye. And there's been extensive research done on it. It was the first fertile triticale was produced in Germany back in the 1800s, but it actually came to Canada in the early 70s, and it started in Western Canada. They were doing a number of research trials on it there, but they actually found that Guelph, in particular, was a really good location for making variety selections for a number of reasons. And so an extensive research program was initiated in Guelph in the 70s. And actually the first licensed variety of triticale in Canada actually came from the Guelph program, which is kind of cool, which was OAC Wintry. And so at the time, a lot of producers at that time were actually growing soft white wheat compared to what we grow today, which is primarily soft red wheat. And at that time, winter triticale seemed to show a lot better winter survival as well as improved yields over those soft white wheat varieties we were growing. It was also interestingly able to achieve very high protein and had a much better disease package. Um, and it also provided an opportunity, particularly in places like Eastern and Northern Ontario that were dealing with a lot of winter kill losses. Triticale seemed to stand up a bit better in those regions, so we did see a bit of a hold with triticale in those parts of the world. Um, However, with triticale, there was some challenges. They still needed to improve on things. The winter hardiness was better, but it still needed to be improved, test weight, those sorts of things. The other challenge with triticale at the time is, it was a major use for feed on farms and still is. because they've really struggled to develop markets for flour, because there were really a lack of international standards, both on quality, or there was a lack of quality standards and international markets. So today, triticale is still primarily used as forage, which is what we're going to talk about, but there are some uses as a grain into some of those specialty mills and baking processes. So again, because of that lack of markets, it never really became super popular. We also saw a shift to soft red wheat in Ontario, which was really successful. So it was difficult to compete with that. But very recently, it's kind of made this massive resurgence, and I think a lot of that has to do with this gentleman here. I'm sure many of you, hopefully a few of you, anyways, have heard of him. And this is Mr. Tom Kelser. So he's a certified crop advisor that is or previously was in New York State. And he has done a ton of research in triticale as a forage, particularly for dairy farms. And this is where a lot of our current recommendations and information still comes from. And so I like to call him the king of triticale. And so he's retired, but he is now working in Tennessee and is still putting out a lot of really valuable research and information on this crop. So we're super appreciative of that. So as a whole, triticale has a lot of options or versatility. It can be harvested both as baleage or as haylage. So this is usually done at flag leaf. So it definitely has to be before heading, and I'm going to touch on some of that later. So usually by mid to late May, we see those triticale fields come off. If you leave it and harvest it at the soft dough stage, it tends to be feed more like a corn silage. And that's primarily because there's the starch developing in the grain. However, with corn silage, we tend to have a lot more forgiveness in terms of our harvest window, whereas with triticale and a lot of the cereals, actually, it's very unforgiving if you get out of the ideal growth stages. And harvesting triticale too late can actually be extremely detrimental in feed quality. So we're going to touch on that in a bit, but harvest timing with this crop is really, really critical if you want to be able to feed high quality feed, especially if you're feeding it in a dairy ration. So overall, winter triticale is a very responsive crop when it comes to management. It will respond very, very well, and it can tiller quite aggressively in the fall. So some of the older varieties were primarily bred for grain, whereas a lot of the new breeding efforts are on forages specifically. And so they've done a really good job of trying to push those varieties towards that aggressive tillering for forages. Triticale, in comparison to crops like wheat, has very, very good standability. And I'm going to touch on this again in a little bit. However, there is a limit to that. And with some of the really high nitrogen rates we're seeing some farms use, we do see it go down. And actually, in 2024, we saw a lot of triticale fields go down. So it's really important to manage our nitrogen to help avoid that. In terms of yields, depending on when you harvest it, it can yield really well. Even 10 years ago, we would see 1.5 to 2 tons to the acre, whereas now we're seeing 2 to 4 tons kind of as an average, with growers actually achieving higher yields with it. So it is a very high yielding crop, especially if you manage it. It does tend to be a little bit later than rye, so typically 10 days later than rye. However, again, some of the newer varieties and some of the newer genetics rather, are actually starting to sync up with rye and to be almost as early as rye. So that 10 days can actually vary and actually be a little bit sooner. And with triticale and rye and a lot of these winter cereals that we take for forage crops also provide a really unique double cropping opportunity. And on a lot of livestock systems, we see that with a short season corn silage crop. So a lot of growers try to opt to take the triticale off, put corn silage in, and have that double crop opportunity. The one thing with triticale, though, that we might see compared to some other options is that we do tend to have a bit of a higher seed cost. So that's something to just keep into account or consideration when sitting down and kind of penciling things out. So what I really wanted to touch on today is, triticale, it provides, it's a very versatile crop that provides a lot of feed opportunity. And what I wanted to talk about with you today is how you maximize your yield potential of your triticale crop year after year. And so there's kind of a step process I like to go through with growers. We do this with wheat as well. And so the first thing that we really need to focus on or think about is the actual variety that is being grown. So I know that there tends to be this desire to use some bin run seed or some old seed we might have from a number of years ago on farm. And you can be successful with that. But with some of the newer genetics, it's definitely worthwhile taking a look at the newer varieties because they provide a lot higher yield potential, tillering capabilities, as well as good disease packages. And so uh, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, what challenges do I face on my farm? What's the right variety for my farm? Is it snow mold? Do I need good disease resistance? Is it that I have a trouble getting it planted in time? Some varieties can tiller better than others. So understanding some of those things would be really helpful in you actually determining what's best suited for your operation. Unfortunately, compared to our winter wheat and winter barley, we don't have any performance data. Actually, I was going to say great performance data, but we actually don't have any great performance data on triticale. So in terms of actually understanding the characteristics of each variety, it's really important that you talk to your seed reps or your agronomists, because a lot of them have experience with these and can also tell you based on some research and small research plots which ones might be best suited for you. But the most common in Ontario are these Infinity and XTR varieties. They seem to be the most common. And like I said, the varieties can vary in their tillering capacity. An example of a variety with good snow mold resistance, and I bring this up just because of the challenges we faced last year with snow mold, which I'll touch on in a little bit as well. But again, this year, unfortunately, the ground is not frozen, and a lot of us have a blanket of snow. And so snow mold resistance is something I think that we're going to have to continue to figure out how to manage, especially as we plant early and have lots of top growth there. I just threw some names of a few companies you can reach out to that have seed. I apologize if I didn't mention everyone here. I was just throwing a few suggestions there, but there are a number of seed companies out there where you can access and get your triticale seed from. So variety is definitely number one thing to consider. The next one that I'm going to touch on, which in my opinion for winter cereals in particular, is probably one of the most important decisions or management factors that will influence your ultimate yield potential in the spring, and that is planting date. Planting date the is by far what cereals are most responsive to, and like I said, is the most critical in terms of optimizing your yields. So this, hopefully you've seen this before. This is the optimum planting date for winter wheat in Ontario, the map. It's in the agronomy guide. If you also want a copy of it, it's on fieldcropnews.com as well as www.gocrops.ca. That's where all our performance trial data is. You can find this map. And so if you find your spot on the map, what we want to be targeting is 10 to 14 days prior to our optimum wheat planting date. So, for example, there, if you're in London, Ontario, you're in Zone E, your optimum planting date for wheat is September 26th. And so your ideal planting window would be 10 to 14 days prior to that. So if it's 10 days prior to September 26th, your ideal planting date there would start at, or would be September 16th. So it's really, really critical that you get that seed planted 10 to 14 days prior. And the reason for that is because the earlier planting dates allows more time for tillering and gives you a thicker stand. We like to see the tillering happening in the fall, and that is what's going to increase your spring yield potential. Having a thick stand also helps you smother weeds, and also allows you to actually, in many cases, harvest ever so slightly early. And that can be critical, especially if you want to double crop something after the fact. I'm not saying that late plantings don't work. They do, they can work. But it is important to know that they are definitely more susceptible to heaving, especially if you're on heavy clay soils. And we also can see some issues with winter kill, again, depending on the scenario and the soil type that you're working with. So again, planting date is really, really critical in optimizing your yields. And this is what we'd like to see coming out of winter when green up is starting. We'd like to see a really nice thick stand like this. So this was a field It was planted around September the 5th for this particular area, which I realize is quite early. But this was actually 11 days prior to the optimum winter wheat planting date for that region. The grower targeted his optimum planting date for triticale, and we had that nice thick stand come spring. And same grower, and this is their 2025 triticale crop. So this crop was also planted on September 5th, 11 days prior to that winter wheat planting date. And there you can see it on at the end of September this year, we had that canopy closure, really nice thick stand, a significant amount of tillering occurring, and then the photo on the right was actually just taken last week before the snow flew. And you can see there we have a very, very thick stand. And so it would be important for this grower to manage their nitrogen in the spring to help manage some of that lodging risk. And I'm going to touch on some of the risks with early planting here in a second. And here's some great data from Tom Kelser, again, out of New York State. And he just highlights, what happens to tillering as we get into later planting dates. So you can see there at that late August planting, we're getting upwards of 10 to 12 tillers between late August and early September. And as we progress through September, even to the end of September, we're dropping down to only about 5 tillers. So that's why this is so critical to get that earlier planting date, because the later we delay it, we get less tillering and less biomass. And we've got some really great research here in Ontario that's been done on winter wheat, where we get the question, okay, I can't plant my crop on time. Are there things that I can do management wise to help mitigate that later planting date? And while bumping up our seeding rates can help a bit, we can't necessarily manage our way out of a late planting date. And this is some work that Emma Dillman did at the University of Guelph on winter wheat. And, the similar applies to here to triticale. And the blue line is the intensive management, and that orange line there is standard management. And what we were anticipating to see is that blue line, as the season progressed or as the planting dates got delayed, we would have liked to have seen that blue line, maybe help flatten that out a bit. But we didn't see that increase in yield by intensively managing our way out of it. So at the end of the day, we cannot manage our way out of a late planting date. And a lot of that has to do with biomass accumulation. Overall, with earlier planting dates in winter cereal crops rather, we just see an overall higher crop growth rates at earlier planting dates. So those later planting dates tend to have biomass accumulation much slower compared to those earlier planting dates. So again, early planting gives us lots of biomass. We also tend to see canopy closure and solar radiation capture much sooner. And so this was just highlighting there at growth stage 39 in early planted crops. We were seeing that those plants were optimizing their solar radiation. So the amount of solar radiation that's available by flag leaf, the early planted crops were achieving 90% of the solar radiation capture to then turn that back into grain or into this situation feed. Whereas the later planting dates, we didn't get that optimum radiation capture until much later in the growing season. And so again, it's just really about the plants being able to optimize the resources that are available to them. And so one thing you can do on your farm, we recommend growers do this with their wheat, and I recommend you try it with your triticale as well, is there's this app called Canopio. I'm not gonna lie, it's a bit dated. It works really well on your computer or your laptop rather than your phone. But what you can do is take a picture of your crop canopy about a meter above the crop canopy, and it'll spit out a canopy percent closure rating. And if that canopy rating is, say, 80%, Emma was able to determine that that also correlates to the amount of solar radiation your crop is actually capturing. So it's a great way to look at if you've got plants that are planted at different seeding dates, you can actually compare and see which ones are optimizing their solar radiation capture sooner. And it just gives you a sense of, are my planting dates working? Do I need to get my plants in the ground sooner or my seeds in the ground sooner so that I can optimize my canopy? So it's just an app to kind of help you compare what's happening between different planting dates. So early planting is really, really critical to optimize your yield potential. However, it does come with some risks. And unfortunately, many growers had to experience these risks in 2025, and I anticipate we might see some of this come spring 2026 as well. And one of those being is this virus called barley yellow dwarf virus. You may have seen some of this last year. And what barley yellow dwarf virus is it's a virus that's transmitted by cereal aphids. So cereal aphids, they tend to show up early in the spring. They'll be in the winter cereals. Then they like to move to spring cereals or corn. And then they like to move to oats. Cover crop oats are a great harbor for aphids, unfortunately. And then they like to move from those cover crop oats into our winter cereal crops, especially those that are seeded early, so winter barley and triticale, unfortunately. And what barley yellow dwarf virus will do is if we get a fall infection, so aphids transmit that virus by feeding on the sap of the plant in the fall, we'll get extreme stunting come the spring, like the photo on the left in the middle, and it'll greatly reduce our biomass. And in cereals we want to take to grain, they won't even head out. In a spring infection, we don't see as big of a yield impact. It tends to be much less than fall infection, but we will see symptoms like the photo on the right there, where we get yellowing of that leaf tip as well as some purpling. So that's something to be on the lookout for. It's very difficult to fully eliminate barley yellow dwarf virus, but a management strategy that you can use on farm to mitigate this and to reduce your risk of infection or the amount of barley yellow dwarf virus that occurs is to use an insecticide seed treatment. So neonics in particular are quite good on aphids. And so if you are going to seed early, a seed treatment to help manage those aphids is really, really critical. Again, it won't totally eliminate it, but it'll help manage the aphid population and keep them from continuing to feed in your fields. The other unfortunate thing that we have to deal with when planting super early is snow mold. And I'm sure many of you saw this. We saw this particularly in triticale fields as well as rye fields last fall. And snow mold tends to occur when a significant amount of snowfall, just like what happened here, is received before the ground freezes. And what happens is it allows that pathogen to be insulated and survive under the snow on the leaf tissue that is there. And unfortunately, with snow mold, the more top growth we have, the more risk for snow mold there is. So this tends to be an issue in areas like, North Wellington, Perth, Huron, Bruce, Grey, where we get tons of snow. But this past year we saw it in a much wider area, and we just did have that last week. So this is something to be on the lookout for next spring. So you'll see plants looking like this. So there's kind of that browning on top. Everything sort of looks dead. But once you get digging there, and if you look at some of these plants there on the bottom left, you can see there's quite the variation in survival between plants, so that those three plants were able to grow out of it. The crown wasn't completely killed by the snow mold or smothered by the snow mold, whereas that plant in the bottom left corner, there was no live tissue in that crown, and so those plants will die. I did some stand counts kind of just randomly in different fields this spring, and it ranged anywhere from a 30% to a 70% stand reduction. So this is definitely something we have to be on the lookout for in thinking about when we're growing early planted triticale. And so the question I've had this spring or this season and even this fall is, how do I manage snow mold? Because it can be quite detrimental. And so Tom Kelser, he did a study, I believe it was last year actually, and he found that very small amounts of sulfur fully applied in the fall is very, very effective at reducing the incidence or amount of snow mold that we see come spring. And so he used a product called Max in sulfur. I believe it's 19% sulfur, and he found really, really good results with this at very low rates of 0.7 to 0.75 pounds of sulfur to the acre. We wanted to try and replicate this project or results. So we did plant a trial with both rye and triticale at New Liskeard Research Station. So big shout out and thanks to Melinda Drummond and Holly Biker. And we didn't have Max In sulfur in Northern Ontario, but we did have this product from Alpine, it's Amsol liquid, and it's 8009. And we applied 0.75 pounds worth of sulfur to the acre with that product. And so we're hoping we'll have some results for everyone next season in this come spring that hopefully we will be able to apply next fall. But if this is something that you're dealing with on farm, foliar sulfur might be an option for you to manage that. The other thing that Tom also pointed out in his research is that selecting good varieties with good resistance is by far the number one and best defense you can use. So using that coupled with sulfur can be extremely helpful. If the resistance of your variety isn't great, that's where the sulfur can help, especially if the genetics are becoming overwhelmed. So again, if this is something you've dealt with last year and you might deal with this year, looking at your genetics and considering the sulfur might help you in managing that. Um, so next up, we wanted to talk a little bit about seeding rates and seeding depths. With any winter cereal, these things are extremely critical in optimizing your yield potential. Based on research in New York State primarily, and uh, from what folks are seeing here in Ontario, we ideally want to seed at about 100 pounds per acre. The range is anywhere from 90 to 125 pounds. If you're going extremely early, you might be able to cut back to that 90 pounds. And if you're going late, because we won't have that same tillering capacity, then we want to consider bumping up that seeding rate to the 125 pounds. It's also, we don't like to use the pounds per acre. We like to try to target seeds per acre. And ideally, I think it's about 300 to 315 plants per square meter that it is that we're trying to target. So it's really critical to look at your label of your seed bag, and you want to look at that because Triticale has a seeds per pound of about 10,000, whereas wheat tends to be anywhere from 11 to 15,000 or 11 to 13,000. So Triticale has larger seeds than wheat, and so that's why a higher seeding rate by weight is needed. And again, if you've got a delayed planting date, having the right seeding rate there can help compensate for some of the less tillering that you're going to see as you get later into the season. And similar to winter wheat, winter barley, whatever winter cereals you are also growing, we really want to target that 1 inch seeding depth. You can see from this photo here on the left, if we go too deep, those plants take a really long time to emerge because it takes about 80 growing degree days for a seed to germinate, and then another 50 growing degree days for every inch of seeding depth. So if you're every inch you're adding on, it's taking that much longer for that plant to emerge, and we want to get that seed out of the ground, up and growing and tillering as quickly as possible. We also have to be careful that we don't go too shallow, because if we do go too shallow, we can run into issues with frost heaving. So hopefully you can see that there, but we actually have some of these seeds just sort of hanging on, and these crowns barely hanging on at the soil surface. And so if you're on heavy clays in particular, we can see a lot of heaving. We're prone to frost heaving there. So ideally, drills can be a little bit tricky or temperamental at times. So targeting a 1 inch seeding depth can be a bit challenging. One of the things to consider is just adjusting your drill depending on you all know your drills better than I, but targeting 1.25 inches, an inch and a half can also help you get that inch seeding depth if it's a bit variable. Um, Again, similar to frost heaving with shallow seeding, we can run into issues like this where we actually will get winter kill. So if that crown is too shallow, we get cold temperatures. We actually tend to get a lot more losses to winter cereals come spring during the freeze thaw events as opposed to actual winter kill. And so this was a picture my colleague, Mike Cobra, took and shared with me. It was a bit of a oops on his farm. And there was the drill was misadjusted, and unfortunately part of it was actually at 1/2 inch seeding depth, and you can see there just at 1/2 inch we saw significant winter kill. So that's why seeding depth is really critical along with seeding rate, again just to get that crop up and going and optimizing your yield potential right out of the gate. The next thing that I hopefully I'm not getting too late, but in terms of, I guess, importance, I would say fall fertility and spring fertility, the next two things we're going to touch on are also extremely important. I know I talked about planting date, but these are also quite important. And hopefully you know this too from growing your winter wheat crop or your winter barley crop, and that is that starter phosphorus is extremely important for winter cereal growth and development. Phosphorus in particular promotes root growth and development. It helps with winter survival. And we also see much more even fields come springtime where phosphorus has been used. Some research out of New York State has also shown interesting enough that some fall applied nitrogen on triticale in particular has been really beneficial to increasing fall tillering and then ultimately increasing our spring yield potential. So this is some work again that was done in wheat, but what they did was they looked at a number of soil fertility backgrounds there. So you can see low P, low K, low P, high K, high P, high K. And they looked at different fertility or different fertilizers to see, what the response would be. And, if we look at something like just simple MAP, so especially for those that are not using manure, this is something to consider. On really low testing soils, we had anywhere from a 15 bushel response on low testing, low P and K. But even on high testing soils, the response there was upwards of 5 bushels, and then across all backgrounds was a 10 bushel response to that seed place phosphorus. So phosphorus is really, really critical. And we would say it's especially critical on clay soils. So these soils don't necessarily reflect some of that because on the heavy clay, they actually saw an even greater response, even if they had a soil test of 35 parts per million using the Olsen test. So if you have clay soils, phosphorus is even more critical. Um, and again, this is wheat information, but we know that this applies to barley, and we also see responses in triticale as well. And then, as I mentioned, what was interesting enough with triticale, which we don't necessarily see in wheat, is that there is some research that shows out of New York that there is also a very small benefit to small amounts of nitrogen applied in the fall. However, this is very dependent on your planting date. So what the research out of New York done by Ketterings was that they found that they had up to 60 pounds of nitrogen was taken up by the crop in the fall. However, on average, about 30 pounds seemed to show a significant yield response. But planting date played a huge role in that, and they only saw these responses in fields that were planted before September 20th. And so that's in New York. So I would anticipate that that date might actually be even a little bit sooner for us here in Ontario. They did not see the same benefit to that fall of nitrogen when applied at later planting dates. And that's likely because the plant just doesn't have the ability to use those nutrients. It's not as developed as those earlier plantings or what we would like to see at earlier plantings. They also looked at the impact of manure in particular with that. And what they found was they definitely had a significant response to that manure with the nitrogen compared to no manure. And they saw a greater response or a higher yield potential with that September planting date compared to that October planting date. So again, if you're getting later into the season, we're not able to get as start at the same yield potential as those earlier planting dates. Hopefully I explained that okay. But because a lot of you work with livestock on your operations, you have something that is a great resource available to you, and that is manure. Um, Manure can be used in some pretty unique ways in this system. If you've got sufficient soil test levels, you don't need to apply additional phosphorus. You can just utilize that manure without any additional fertilizer or any additional nitrogen. You can just utilize that manure. But it is important to know that not all manures are equal. Ammonium levels, for example, in solid manure tends to be quite low, but because we are applying it a month earlier than say we would in other crops, the fall and the spring gives us additional time for that organic nitrogen to become available to the plant. However, if we have a cold backwards spring, it will result in lower availability than what we would see the same manure applied to, say, a corn crop. And again, uh, liquid manure can be also applied in the fall, but again, that has to be at a relatively low rate. And if we're using manure in the system, this is really, really critical that no more than half to 2/3 of our total nitrogen that is needed for the crop should come from manure. So I gave an example here that if you needed 120 pounds of nitrogen applied to that crop, you don't want to see more than 90 pounds come from manure sources. You want it to be supplemented with fertilizer. And the reason for that we don't want more than a half or two-thirds to come from manure is because there is very slow manure availability in the spring when the soil is cold, which I just mentioned, which results in low microbial activity. And so the available N from manure that you would typically calculate when you're trying to apply also is usually based on manure N for a corn crop. Whereas a cereal crop, we tend to apply it about a month earlier, especially if you're doing it in the spring. And again, the soils are cold, so it's not activating that manure and making it available for the plants. So what happens is that the manure, the nitrogen in the manure, might not actually be available when you need it to be available for the cereal crop. And so that's why we always recommend that you supplement with commercial fertilizer. Um, I guess some other things to mention too is that liquid hog manure has the quickest availability, and so it tends to have the highest success as a top dress nitrogen source for, excuse me, wheat or cereals in general. It's also important to know that separated dairy manure will also be more available than unseparated dairy manure. So again, those are some differences there. And overall, triticale is really effective at utilizing fall manure applications, but generally speaking, we don't really recommend top dressing with it in the springtime, again, because of the availability or lack thereof. And again, if you are going to apply manure, which I'm sure many of you are ahead of triticale in the fall, it's really important if you are able to incorporate that. And that is primarily because we want to reduce any risk of that phosphorus running off. So again, in terms of the fall, we really want to be making sure that we're getting that phosphorus down. If we've got good soil test levels, manure is fine. We don't need to add additional fertility. If we don't have manure, we want to make sure that we're putting down some phosphorus and possibly a bit of nitrogen. And then if we are putting a significant down amount of manure, we want to make sure that we're supplementing that with a half to two-thirds to a half with commercial fertilizer to ensure that when that crop demand is there for those nutrients in the spring, that there is nutrients available there for it. So in terms of in-season fertility, we do have some older research in Ontario that showed that at the time, so this is about 10, 11 years ago now, at that time, some really great work done by Peter Johnson and Shane McClure showed that 60 pounds seemed to be a really good rate of nitrogen for optimizing triticale yields. However, since then, we've seen a significant amount of breeding efforts in new triticale varieties, and we see that they have much higher yield potential. And so on these numbers here that you can see, we're getting anywhere from 1 to 1.75 tons of dry matter per acre, which is probably half of what we're getting now. So some newer research shows that these rates should actually be quite a bit higher. But what was interesting in the work that Peter and Shane did is that they showed the estimate cattle gains from winter cereals at the boot stage just to compare to kind of see where things landed. And it's really interesting to see there that triticale is highly competitive with something like rye. So cereal rye is one that's very commonly used. It tends to be much better than winter barley, and again is a little bit better than winter wheat as well. So it's really effective in terms of it is really good at increasing your pounds of beef per acre compared to some of the other cereals, and is highly competitive with fall rye. And it also tends to have higher levels of digestible energy compared to fall rye. But the more recent research shows that where we actually should be sitting with nitrogen is at about 100 pounds of N applied in early spring, especially right at green up. So when you start to see those plants actually green up, we need at least a week of positive growing degree day accumulations. And getting out there with 100 pounds of nitrogen is an ideal and seems to be the most economic rate of response. We see significant increases in yield or crude protein. However, what we're seeing as a bit of a trend here in Ontario is that we're seeing very high rates of nitrogen being applied. We're seeing anywhere from 150 to 250 pounds of nitrogen per acre applied. And what we saw as a result of that is a significant amount of lodging. And so, if you are in this camp, we would recommend you pull back on some of those nitrogen rates because those extreme nitrogen rates are contributing to your lodging. And it's also, from a 4R perspective, to be frank, not great. And so, we're likely going to see some losses from that. The other thing that we need to take into account is that, and Christina, I think, has done some really great articles on this, is we could actually run the risk of some nitrate poisoning. So it's really important to, look at our systems and try to bring that in, especially if we're using manure, try to make that manure go further as possible because it is a valuable resource to you. But we don't need these extremely high rates of 150 and 250 pounds per acre. We will see some losses, and it's not necessarily all going to be there for the corn crop. So again, that's something to keep in mind. And again, generally speaking, we don't recommend top dressing manure stands in the spring because we do see that issue with availability to the crop when the crop demand is there. The other nutrient that we really need to make sure we're paying close attention to, in addition to nitrogen, is sulfur. Sulfur is really, really important for a number of plant functions. And when it comes to triticale and forages in particular, it's going to really help you with increasing your crude protein. In winter cereals, we tend to see a range of anywhere from 10 to 25 pounds of sulfur, but this greatly depends on your soil type and your history of sulfur deficiency. If you are on a farm that has history of sulfur deficiency in your other crops, you likely need to apply on the higher end. We do see that some folks like to use a ratio of 10 to 1. So for every 10 pounds of nitrogen you apply, they like to see a pound of sulfur. So if you're doing 100 pounds of nitrogen, to apply 10 pounds of sulfur. But again, it's going to really depend on your history of sulfur deficiency and your soil type. In the work that Tom Kilser and Ketterintons did, I believe that they found you could use as much as 40 pounds of sulfur. But again, it's really going to depend on your history of your field there. So high yielding crops of 4 tons of dry matter to the acre, they have seen as high as 40 pounds of sulfur, or that they use as much as 40 pounds of sulfur. So if you are wanting to supplement with spring sulfur, a good option would be ammonium sulfate that you would apply at greenup. Okay, so I'm just realizing how much time it is, so I'll try to speed this up. So the next thing that I wanted to touch on is harvest and quality. And much like planting date, that's really important, getting your crop set up for success. Another really, really important timing is harvest. You could do all this work all fall, all spring, and throw it all away by harvesting your crop at the wrong time. And so for triticale in particular, to optimize your quality, it is really, really, really critical to make sure you target it at that flag leaf stage. That has the highest nutrient quality. Your digestibility, your protein, your palatability, everything drops once you get to the heading stages. So it's really, really important that we target that window. The other challenge with this timing is that depending on the temperature, the moisture, the variety, all sorts of outside forces, this window can be very, very short. So if it's very hot or starting to get very hot, this window will shorten faster. If it's cool, like last spring, we found that it was a fairly cool window. It actually provided a wider window for producers to get out and get that crop harvested. But on a really hot spring, that window could be less than 5 days. In some cases, we've seen wheat and triticale and other winter cereals just run through those growth stages. So it's really, really critical leading up to this point. You're getting out in your field and you're staging your crop. And I threw in a QR code there for the wheat staging guide to help you identify what that flag leaf looks like and how to determine if you have that flag leaf emerge. And so flag leaf is the best quality for dairy. So if you're a dairy producer, flag leaf is the best timing for quality. While the soft or late milk stage can be used as a silage for things like stage or stage things like steers, because this stage can provide you with a balance between yield and quality for those purposes. Again, in terms of yields, I guess if we're going to harvest it, it's usually stored as haylage, but it also can be stored as baleage. It can be difficult though to wilt to get the appropriate silage moisture. So those that have experience with this will do wide swathing because that'll help with that. The other thing is to note is, we have these range of yields, but the yields really vary on your management and the area that you're in. So if you're not managing the crop, you're going to likely be on that lower end of that yield range. And again, if you're in a shorter season, you might, depending on when your planting date is, you might see lower yield potentials as well. But for the most part, they can range from anywhere from 2 to 4 tons of dry matter per acre, with averages at 2 and 2.5. And then we have some really high managed producers that are even above that 4 tons to the acre. Again, at the flag leaf stage, that's when we tend to see our crude protein levels typically are around 16%. But again, if you've got your fertility on point, your planting date on point, you're doing all the things right, the crude protein levels can actually exceed 18%. At this stage, NDF can be under 50%, and sugars, fiber digestibility, and rates of digestion are also high. So again, crop quality at the flag leaf stage is the best crop quality you're going to get with this crop. Um, and then at the head stage or head emerge stage, we see that crude protein drop down to 13 to 14%. NDF increases to over 60%. And again, we see that digestibility drop. It's still great for steers or heifers or dry cows. But if you're feeding for a dairy ration, you definitely want to be targeting that flag leaf stage. And then the other piece, I guess, before we wrap it up here, and open the floor for discussion is around double cropping opportunities. So triticale and rye provide a good window because they come off in May that we could still get a crop planted. But it is really, really critical that we do all the things leading up to planting that crop to make sure that we are going to be successful. And the first thing to do is to ensure that we are completely killing that rye or triticale crop, with herbicides, so glyphosate. I know some growers like to use tillage, because the idea here is that we need to really minimize any staging or competition for moisture, especially if things start to turn dry like they did last year. If we do see a dry year and we don't have a lot of moisture following these forage crops, we can see significant negative yield impacts on the following crop, whatever it is that you might be planting. We also know that there are some that like to no-till, and that can conserve your moisture. But again, if you're getting hard, dry soils following triticale, or your rye crop, it can create some challenges for the double crop to actually get a root system developed. And again, it could really make it a challenge for it to get to moisture, and that's why we ultimately see, that yield impact. Um, if you're going to double crop with corn silage, it's really important that you look at your heat units and you select the right hybrid because you are planting later. And those, if we have to use a lower heat unit corn crop, you might also see a bit of a reduced yield potential for your corn silage. So that's just something to keep in mind. Um, so yeah, I guess just while you're probably gaining 2 or more tons of really good quality triticale forage, you could also be giving up anywhere from 1/2 to 2.5 tons of corn silage yield, by having to reduce the variety that you're selecting. Um, and again, in 2,800 to 3,200 heat units, if you're planting on May 30th, you could reduce yield by 7% and 11% on June 15th. But if you flip that to a lower heat unit area, that jumps up to 15 and 25% respectively. So again, just something to keep in mind when thinking about your system that way. If your intention is to plant triticale after corn silage, this is also an equally important time for you to make sure that you're selecting the right corn variety, because we obviously want to have ideal corn silage quality, but we also need to make sure that we're getting that triticale planted really, really early in the fall in September. And so if you're not able to get that corn silage off until later, you might need to consider looking at a different corn hybrid. Um, Again, if we're delaying our soybean planting, if we're going to plant soybeans after, the delay from that is less significant. In some areas, it can be as high as 8%, but in others, especially longer areas, the yield impact there could even be less than that. And then if you have, something like sorghum Sudan grass or Sudan grass, there doesn't tend to be any yield impact because we're not really delaying our planting date for those crops after triticale. And then lastly, just a couple other considerations. I actually took this from Joel Bagg. I'm not sure if he's on, but he's, a really great resource who works a lot in triticale. And one of the comments that I've seen him make is that it isn't a complete replacement for alfalfa grass mixes, but it does provide us an alternative quality feed to double crop, and especially in longer season regions. It's also important to know that alfalfa grass tends to have higher crude protein content and good digestibility. So alfalfa still is a really good, crop to have in your system. And there also is that nitrogen credit that we get from alfalfa and the rotational benefit to corn and soybeans. And then lastly, as I mentioned at the beginning, that seed costs for triticale can be higher and input costs as well compared to something like alfalfa. So again, those are some things to consider when making the decision to grow or switch to triticale over something like alfalfa. And so there was kind of a lot of information that I just threw at you there. So if there's anything that you take away, it would be these four things today. And that's that, triticale is a really good option. It can produce very good feed, highly digestible dairy feed, and it can complement other forages in your system. The key to success with it is to seed early, at least 10 to 14 days prior to your winter wheat planting date. We want to be getting that in the ground well before September 20th. Targeting and optimizing your fertility needs, especially with nitrogen and sulfur, will help you increase the yield potential of that crop, and make sure that you're selecting varieties that address the needs on your farm. So if snow mold and lodging are a concern, or you're going to be planting later, make sure that you're looking for those characteristics in those varieties. Don't just kind of pick one out of the sky because that can have an influence on your overall success. And with that, I apologize. I know that was a lot of information, but happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Joanna. Yeah, I'm getting my thoughts organized because that that was a lot of great information. I feel like every time I talk to you or hear you talk about cereals, I learn so much. So there are a few questions going back to that snow mold issue.
Okay.
Um, are there any fungicide options for managing that, first of all?
So that's a good question. I was hoping I was going to have enough space in this trial to do a fungicide treatment. Unfortunately, I didn't. So we are just looking at sulfur. What I do know is that to date, research on fall fungicides in winter cereals haven't really shown an economic advantage. However, it's very, very difficult to do a trial with a disease that is kind of unpredictable as well. So my goal is to get some more information on this. Right now, the research or information we have is that they aren't economical, and they aren't as I guess as effective as some of this foliar sulfur work seems to be. So the answer to that is kind of TBD. I wish I had a better answer for that, but unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of strong data that shows it's effective.
So save your money for now. We're looking into it.
Yeah.
Okay. So you talked about, that foliar sulfur application seems to be a promising way to manage snow mold. Could you soil apply that sulfur with nitrogen at or just after planting? Is that effective?
Um, yeah, so I believe that Tom looked at that too. And so we definitely see the advantage to the sulfur in crude protein. But in terms of snow mold, we haven't. So it seems to be, and I apologize, I just don't know the science behind it yet. It seems to be that that foliar application in particular is doing something to that crop that's protecting it against the snow mold. From the work that Tom's done with sulfur, like still using a product like Mez, for example, we haven't seen the same benefits as it relates to snow mold, but there has been benefits to increasing crude protein.
Okay, thank you. And one of the attendees on tonight says that all of their triticale seed came treated this fall with a four-way treatment,
Okay.
and they were told that it was partially to help with snow mold risk. Do you know, or in your experience, is seed treatment helpful for snow mold?
So I want to say that this one is also a mixed bag. We we haven't seen the consistent benefits to that seed treatment on snow mold in particular. In some instances, we seem to see a bit of a reduction of snow mold incidence. So I would say that it's not something that we can 100% depend on, but I would say with this the seed treat the fungicide seed treatment in combination with variety resistance, we might see a lower incidence. But again, I would say that that's been pretty inconsistent.
Okay, thanks. When you were talking about in-season fertility, I'm just a cowboy with an air seeder. You mentioned 4R. What's that?
Oh, sorry. Uh, oh gosh, now I might get caught on this. Right place, right time, right source. Uh, oh no,
Right
I just
rate?
yeah, right, right. Thank you.
Source rate, time,
Source
place.
rate, time,
Yeah.
place. Yeah. So the concept of 4R is about making sure that we're putting our fertilizer on at the right place, right time, according to crop demand, that we're using the right source based on crop demand, that we're not putting on too much, like 250 pounds of nitrogen, for example. It's really about it's a concept that's been developed through the certified crop advisors, and it's like an approach to fertility on Ontario farms to reduce the environmental impact of our fertilizer applications. Is that
Thanks.
a fair summary? I don't know. There's
Yeah.
probably some souls people on here cringing right now as I say that.
That I think got to the crux of it is it's a framework for making sure you're not wasting money and not sending fertilizer out into the environment where it shouldn't be. All right. Our next question is that you talked about the value of targeting the ideal planting date. Um, but how late is too late to plant triticale in the fall, particularly if, you're tight on feed and trying to get something in the ground on short notice?
So that's a great question. I would say it's going to, that we talked this before. It depends. It depends on what kind of growing season or what kind of area region you're in and the amount of growing degree days and growth that you're going to get in the fall. Um, we're seeing with triticale, if we tried to plant that into October into a shorter seasoned area, we tend to be quite disappointed on our yields. So we don't see, in some cases, we'll see less than 2 tons of dry matter to the acre. And so if you're in a situation where you are in need of emergency forage, you are looking for something to be able to double crop after, I think you could still do it in longer season areas, to the end of September. But ideally, we don't like to see it push into October, and that's because triticale won't tiller in the spring like wheat does. It's not as aggressive at wheat, so um, I would say in an emergency forage situation, it's still possible to plant into, the later parts of September, early parts of October, but I wouldn't be pushing that. I would only be looking at that in the deep south sort of thing. I wouldn't be looking at in the shorter season areas. I would consider alternative options like winter
Alter
wheat.
well, yeah, well, and alternative options is a great
Or
segue into the next
I
question.
guess or rye. Sorry.
Yeah, the next question is what are your thoughts on triticale versus
Oh.
rye as a forage crop? Because these two often get
Yeah.
grouped together. So how are they different? When should growers choose one over the other?
Yeah, so actually that is a good segue. I would say actually if in that situation you're not able to plant your triticale, that 10 to 14 days, rye tends to be more forgiving. I mean, don't do this, anyone, but we have growers that have actually tried to plant it like in December and January, and get some growth. But it tends to be a bit more. It is a crop that you could plant a little bit later compared to triticale. So if that situation you can't get your triticale planted on time, looking at something like rye would be a good alternative. The other thing with rye versus triticale is that rye tends to be earlier. So for those that still want to try to grow closer to a full season corn hybrid or are really wanting to get their soybeans planted earlier, then rye might be a better fit because it tends to be 10 days earlier than triticale on average, depending on the variety. Um, so that can be an option. And rye also, in terms of like cat, if you're looking at cattle gains per acre, rye tends to be a slightly higher than triticale, but it's still, I would say they're pretty close that way. Like triticale, we saw last year, rye can also be, especially if there's lots of top growth there, susceptible to snow mold. So that's another thing to keep in mind with that. Um, I don't know, rye just seems to grow. Like also rye really likes some marginal lands. So again, depending on the kind of ground that you're on, rye can do well in some of those situations as well. But I would say, yeah, if you're getting on the later side, then rye might be the one to consider over triticale.
Can you keep the same fertilizer plan for rye that you would use on triticale?
Yeah, you can do that. I would
Even the
definitely
nit
still,
even the nitrogen?
no, not, sorry, no, your spring nitrogen you want to cut back on your spring nitrogen, but if you want to use manure ahead of it and get that phosphorus in, you can definitely do that, but you're going to want to cut your nitrogen rates back on rye, otherwise it's going to be flat and Christine's going to be yelling at me for telling you to put 100 pounds of nitrogen on your rye.
It falls over. Um, okay, so our next question is kind of switching gears a little bit. It's just wondering if triticale grain can be used for milling.
Yes, it can. But if you want to grow it for milling, I would try to have that lined up ahead of time, because it's not like wheat in that there's a super, well-developed market for it. So there are definitely some specialty mills in Ontario that take some things like triticale, spelt, some of those, smaller acreage crops. So yeah, you can definitely grow it as a grain. But again, I would make sure that you are looking at the variety that you're growing because the varieties that you're going to grow or want to grow for forages have a little bit of a different. Oh man, I just had a brain fart there. Sorry. Oh yeah, forage triticale tends to have more focus on tillering and biomass, whereas like triticale that's grown or bred for grain has more of like the actual quality parameters for milling that are focused on that are more focused on milling quality.
Okay, thank you. So back to our forage questions. So in that double crop situation where we know we're going to plant something after the triticale, would you need to spray Roundup before cutting in the spring to get a complete kill on that crop?
I don't believe so. Mike Cobra would probably better than me, but no, we'd like to see that glyphosate applied after you cut the crop, not before, and you will still get a complete kill for that crop.
And yeah, that's been my understanding of it as well. Cut your forage, take that off the field, wait for a bit of regrowth so you got the leaf material there, and then hit it with your burn down.
Yeah. But make sure you give that crop after you cut it and after you've sprayed it the time, a little bit of time, because you definitely want to make sure you have a good kill before you plant that subsequent crop. Especially in those early stages, that rye or that triticale can be very, very competitive to that corn or soybean crop and can smother it. And like we said, or I had mentioned, it can really take the moisture out of the soil. So it's really, really important um, that you get a good kill before you plant that crop.
Okay. Um, so this question is kind of following up on our rye versus triticale kind of conversation earlier and which one's a better fit for late planting. Because it sounds like rye is more forgiving on planting date. It's ready earlier for that harvest. So why are farmers spending more money on triticale seed? Is triticale better than rye?
So my understanding, I'm not a nutritionist, so keep that in mind, but is that the feed quality of triticale tends to be better, much better than rye. So although it can be forgiving on seeding and planting or planting dates and harvest, and yields even can be competitive, the actual quality of triticale tends to be much better, especially for dairy, than rye.
Okay, thank you. I think we've got time for one more question here, maybe two, because I want to sneak one in at the end. So when is the best time to apply liquid dairy manure in the fall? Is that before or after seeding? Are there times that they should avoid applying manure to this crop?
Sorry, dairy manure ahead of triticale. Oh, so I would say
Before or after seeding
before.
the triticale, like when
Ideally, we'd like to have that manure incorporated. Again, it just is going to help us reduce the risk of phosphorus runoff. So ideally, we'd like to see that before seeding.
All right. And I think we kind of leaned into this a little bit in our discussion that there is no one perfect forage crop. So we've talked about all the ways that, triticale can be a great fit on some farms. My question is, can you think of a couple of situations where triticale might be a bad fit, where this is not a good option, um, for a grower?
If, yes, I would say it's primarily around management. So if you are in a system or the system that is currently working for you doesn't allow you to get that triticale planted in good time, then this might not be a good fit for you because you might feel or you might not get the same yield potential and disappointed in the amount of forage that you get. So if you can't plant in good time, triticale may not be a fit. And I would also say if you can't manage it or you aren't managing it, so you're not hitting it with the right amounts of nitrogen, if you are not managing disease, those sorts of things, then triticale is not the fit for you. Triticale is very, very responsive to management, and it's a crop that we can push, much like winter wheat. And maybe that's something I should have mentioned with even rye, is that we don't see rye is not as responsive to management as triticale. So the more you push triticale, the more you're going to get out of it. And if you're just not able to do that, then triticale may not be the right fit either. And that's where maybe rye might be a better solution for you, because you don't have to push rye as much. It doesn't take as much inputs, and the seed costs also tend to be lower.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joanna. We're a little over time, so I'm going to turn things back to Birgit to close us out.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you for Christine for fielding the questions for us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. And another thank you for our sponsors tonight, Porteous Russell Real Estate, Range Ward, and Trillium Mutual Insurance. Without our sponsors, we cannot put a program like this together. So thank you. We'll see you all back here tomorrow night for part 2 of our Forage Focus 2025 series. Have a good night.